Hi, I'm Michelle, an illustrator and concept artist, and this is a breakdown of how I think when I design creatures. When I started sketching, the only things I knew were that 1. I wanted a quadruped, aka an animal that walks on 4 legs, and 2. It had to live in the savannah. Some people like to design with no framework or boundaries, but I personally find absolute freedom and a blank page daunting. Giving yourself a jumping off point doesn't mean you're trapped with your initial ideas, it just gives your imagination something to grab onto. For this design, I drew inspiration from ungulates, aka hoofed animals like horses for the head shapes and proportions mixed with canines like wolves. Normally I would start with a bunch of thumbnails, but since this was just a warm-up design, I let myself go right in with the sketch. I always start with the major mass of the skull, then pull out a muzzle when designing vertebrates. The first things I figured out were the overall proportions and eye and ear placement. In this case, this boy has a long, sloped muzzle that resembles a horse, but the forward-facing eyes are more commonly found on predators. I also replaced the horse's horizontal pupil in favor of the round pupil of predators like wolves and tigers. Moving on to the body, you can see that like the head, I started with big overall shapes and proportions. A basic quadruped layout includes masses for the head, ribcage, and pelvis. After finding these, I attached limbs. My creature's forelegs resemble a horse's, but there are several key differences, the most noticeable of which is the 3 toes on each foot instead of the singular hoof. Why did I do this, and why does my reasoning matter? In a professional setting, you need to be able to justify your design choices to an art director or client. Sometimes rule of cool or it just looks cool can work, but I like to create things with an underlying logic, and those choices are usually easier to explain to others. In this case, I decided to give this boy 3 toes instead of a hoof because it references an earlier evolutionary period and also ties into modern predators like big cats and wolves, which both have paws. Let's break those points down farther. If you don't know, vertebrates all follow the same body layout with 4 limbs and 5 digits at the end of each limb. Ungulates took that plan and merged the 5 digits into 1 or 2 digits covered in a hoof. Evolution isn't a fast process, so there were many species of early ungulates that had 5 digits, 4, 3, 2, and so on. In theory, this creature would fall somewhere in the middle of the evolutionary timeline. The central digits have merged, but the outer digits remain, leaving him with 1 large central toe and 2 smaller supporting structures. Moving back to the full picture, you might notice this boy isn't as long as a typical horse and has different hind legs. Here is where the canine influence comes in, specifically that of African wild dogs, also known as painted dogs. These pack animals' main hunting strategy involves winning an endurance match against their prey. The open, relatively flat savanna works well for this strategy because you can keep your target in sight while patiently waiting for them to get tired of running from you and your hungry friends. Our fantasy beast follows a similar hunting strategy in its imaginary savanna, and this is implied by the lanky legs and the big rib cage for a larger heart and lungs. Now we get to the coat color and pattern. I went with a neutral brown and cream color scheme that blends into dry grass. The stripes resemble a zebra, another nod to the horse inspiration, but with a different color palette. I added the darker stripes to the tail and face for visual contrast. In the face's case, this also draws attention to the focal point of the design. Humans naturally gravitate towards faces, and adding detail and contrast here rewards a viewer for looking there. Finally, I added some subtle color variation. Real animals have color variation in their fur, feathers, or scales that goes beyond bold markings. Adding the gradient from a dark to lighter tan and some peach to the stripes makes our fantasy boy more believable. And this is how I went from idea to finished design. As a recap, I started with my basic inspirations, which were savanna-dwelling quadruped, picked specific real-life animals for reference, focused on big overall proportions and masses, then details, and finally color. Hope this was helpful, and I'll catch you in the next one.